Hello, welcome to another edition of Oklahoma Politics and You. Tonight we're going to talk about the Republican candidates for President of the United States. It's a very impressive and interesting field that we have, all the way from the New Yorker Rudy Giuliani to the Colorado guy Tom Tancredo, former actor Fred Thompson. But a candidate this year that has caused probably has been more different, if that's good English, than any of the other candidates has been Texas Congressman Ron Paul. Tonight, Gary Cooper, my co-host, and I'm Steve Byas. We have a special guest who is a person who is active in the Ron Paul campaign here in Oklahoma. And we're going to talk about the Ron Paul phenomena because he is somebody that just kind of came out of nowhere as far as the national consciousness to really add a lot of flavor to the campaign this year and especially to the debates. And our guest is Porter Davis. Welcome to the program, Mr. Davis.
Steve, good to see you.
And Porter Davis is a former state representative here in Oklahoma. Served back in the 80s, I remember that. Porter, tell us, our viewers, just real quick, a little bit about yourself leading up to your supporting Ron Paul in this campaign.
Well, I'm a businessman. I was in the state legislature. I ran as an independent in 1976, and I ran as a Republican in 1982, and served one term. I didn't run for a second term because of some business obligations and family obligations that I had. I worked in the mid-'80s for Pat Robertson in preliminary work prior to his campaign, and I was the state coordinator of what they called the Freedom Council. I was elected a delegate to the 1988 Republican Convention. I was one of two delegates from Oklahoma on the platform committee. And then I got a lot more busy in business, and I really put my musket on the wall, if you will, put it up on over the fireplace, and had grown actually more and more disillusioned with the whole political process as I began to see how controlled it really was by the media and the large financial interests in the country, and that I feel like we go through the illusion of a free election, but the candidates are really sort of vetted and picked and chosen, and we're told who the front runners are and who the viable candidates are, and
front
who aren't.
tier and,
yeah.
and all that, yeah.
Top tier. You know, Fred Thompson, before he even decided he was going to run, everybody decided for some reason he was going to be a top-tier candidate, and there's nothing in the record to substantiate that.
It seems almost like every election, the ones the media consider outside of the top tier are the ones I think are the best candidates. Have you ever noticed that type of thing?
Well, I think that's true because George Wallace said it back in the 70s, and others said it before that. There's not a whole lot of difference, really. Substantively, you can hear a different rhetoric, but between the Republicans and the Democrats, not much really changes from administration to administration. We've gone from the first George Bush administration to the first Clinton administration, now the second Bush administration, and very likely the second Clinton administration if they anoint who it looks like it's going to be. But the government keeps getting larger and larger, and the true choice that we have as people gets less and less.
I've heard it said that if you go to a meeting of local Republican activists and then go to a meeting of local Democrat activists, you can see a huge difference. But when you get to places like the Congress of the United States, that difference begins to be less and less. Probably the thing that got Ron Paul the attention early on was that he took a position different, I would think, from any of the other Republican candidates on the issue of the Iraq War.
Right.
Okay. And tell us, what is Ron Paul's position on the war in Iraq?
Well, Ron Paul thinks it was a mistake from the beginning. He was very much for going after who were indicated to be the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks. Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden were indicated by the government, and he was an early sponsor of a particular resolution. I forget the name of it. I'd never heard of it before, but there is an actual provision for going after people that take bandit-like actions on their own, and he was for going after them in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
But there was absolutely no reason whatsoever, and history has shown that, to attack Iraq for what happened on 9/11. That was clearly a war of choice. It was clearly something the Bush administration and the neoconservatives that control it wanted from the beginning, and they did everything they could to cook the intelligence to have their way. And it's amazing, even today, a good majority of people in this country still think that Iraq and Saddam Hussein had something to do with it, and that's because of the drumbeat of the Bush administration higher up saying so, and there was never a shred of proof that Iraq and Saddam Hussein had anything to do with it. And so Ron Paul, not holding up his finger to see which way the wind is blowing, was against the Iraq war from the beginning, and very clearly so. He believes in a non-interventionist foreign policy, free trade with all and friendly relations, but basically the foreign policy that the founders wisely advocated back at the time of the Declaration of Independence and later the U.S. Constitution, of having friendly relations with others and not trying to create an empire.
You know, John Quincy Adams once said that we are the friends of freedom throughout the world, but guardians only of our own. Would you say that would be Ron Paul's philosophy?
I would think so. I mean, I came to support Ron Paul. Of course, I've known of him for almost 35, 40 years, and we share the same philosophy, which is the freedom philosophy. And I had always thought, and he would say too, that the United States should be a beacon to the rest of the world. And I think most of us have thought that we should stand for something good and right and noble and set an example that other peoples can aspire to. And today we've become a pariah nation. We're probably the most hated nation in the world today. And how did we get there? How did this happen? And I think it has to do with the empire building we've had, that we clearly had blowback on 9/11, and then the Iraqi war has just totally destroyed our relations with most of the nations of the world. We have a horrible reputation right now.
Okay. You know, when you, like I said, you know, we talked about this before, you know, obviously the Iraq war is what got Dr. Paul so much attention at the beginning. But there are other things about Ron Paul that probably our viewers need to be aware of. And for example, he ran for president of the United States before,
right,
as a libertarian on the Libertarian Party. Now, there's a difference between the Libertarian Party and libertarians. You know, people can be libertarians without being members of the Libertarian Party and so forth. But he ran on the Libertarian Party for president in 1988, and a lot of people said, well, how can he claim to be a Republican? So what would you say, what would be his answer or your answer to that?
Well, I think philosophically he's a libertarian, but most activists that are Republicans, at least prior to the current Bush administration, would pretty much adhere to libertarian types of ideas. Ronald Reagan largely enunciated those. Barry Goldwater enunciated those. Robert Taft.
Yeah.
The traditional old right, if you will. And there's an award I think you may have something to do with called the Rhino Award, Republican in name only. And I think what they're referring to is what most Republican conservative activists refer to as a libertarian-oriented philosophy. When they say Republican in name only, they're not just referring to a party, they're referring to a philosophy that they impute to Republican politics. And I think that's why, you know, and he says that the Republican Party, when it's on its best behavior and adhering to its classical principles, would be very close to his personal philosophy, and that's why he chose that. When I ran as a Republican, I had not abandoned my libertarian beliefs, but that was in the aftermath or during the Reagan Revolution, and I felt like I could embrace it certainly more than I could the Democrats. And it's having run as an independent once myself, I know it's very difficult to get any traction as an independent.
Yeah. I have some Ron Paul literature here. He says as president he would let Americans keep more of their own money. Do you say that would be most Republicans would agree, active Republicans would agree with that.
Yeah, I would say most Republicans prior to the Bush administration believe in limited government, greatly reduced taxation, less regulations, sound money, and free trade.
He would secure our borders and end illegal immigration. I would say that's a pretty popular position in the Republican Party.
It is. We obviously need to have good, strong immigration laws, and we haven't had that under this Republican administration.
I know that Milton Friedman, I think it was, that said that you really can't have open borders and a welfare state. It doesn't work.
Yeah, definitely.
Gary Cooper, why don't you ask our guests questions?
One of the things that, and of course I've been an admirer of Ron Paul ever since I first got into politics. He served in Congress for many years, and several years after running for president, he came back into Congress as a Republican again. And one of the things that he's always been very articulate about in Congress, and I think has done so as well as a presidential candidate, is talking about the tremendous burden, both financial and moral burden on the country of the enormous welfare state that we have. It is a crushing burden of taxing and spending, spending and taxing, and not to mention that it saps the lifeblood of those it's supposed to help. Tell us a little bit about Ron Paul's philosophy. How do we get a handle on this great big serpent of federal spending, and what is his philosophy and as far as what should the government be involved in and what should it not be involved in?
Well, let me make it clear, I'm not a designated official spokesman for Ron Paul. I'm an enthusiastic supporter, and I did speak at the rally, but I have no official position with the campaign. But his view would be he has earned the reputation or the moniker, they call him Dr. No. He's a medical doctor, and he votes no consistently on any legislation for any programs and spending that violate the precepts of the Constitution. So all these things you mentioned, he would vote no against. He would vote against farm subsidies. He would vote against the government being in the welfare business. He knows, I know on the Social Security issue, he has recognized that many people have bought into that, and we need to make provisions for them to get their money's worth, if you will, but at the same time, stop digging the hole deeper. Anyone that will speak candidly about the Social Security and the Medicare situation will tell you those systems will collapse under their own weight within 20 years or so. And that's one of the reasons Ron Paul, I think, is taking off so much with young people is my kids have no illusion they're going to have anything to collect from Social Security.
But they still pay.
They still pay, and they know that we and the generation before us have laid a huge burden on them and put them while they got many advantages to start with, the birds are coming home to roost now, and they are going to be dealing with the consequences of this massive welfare and warfare state that we have erected. And they hear a clear voice coming from Ron Paul. I mean, he's as surprised as anyone that the freedom message is suddenly starting to gain traction right now. And this 72-year-old grandfather is almost like a rock star politically with young people. It's not Obama that's taking off. He's taking off with a certain democratic liberal bent, but in terms of people that understand freedom, Ron Paul's the one that's taking off with young people right now, and why they're raising such an incredible amount of money. I checked the website today, and they have almost reached their goal of $12 million for this quarter, which is more than John McCain has raised, and Fred Thompson, and many of the candidates in terms of actual money raised outside of their own loans to their campaigns, like Mitt Romney has done.
Well, something else that, and Steve mentioned as he read from some of the campaign literature, not since the 80s have we had a Republican presidential candidate talk about something that is near and dear to the heart of a lot of us old conservatives, and that is sound money, the idea of a gold and silver standard. Now, to a lot of younger people haven't a clue, after living of so many decades of fiat money or money that's just backed by the credit of the United States, not by gold and silver, don't understand why that was so important, why the framers intended for a gold and silver currency. but Ron Paul has talked about this. Tell us a little bit about what does Ron Paul mean when he talks about sound money?
When he talks about sound money, he looks at what happened with the 16th Amendment back in 1915 or 13, and the Federal Reserve System. Both came into being at about the same time. And from up until that time, we had sound money, and now the dollar's worth maybe 3 cents what it was at that time. You know, a $20 gold piece was a $20 gold piece. Today, a $20 gold piece would sell for just the gold content is worth $800 or $900. And so he would be for abolishing the Federal Reserve System. When I spoke, I don't know if you were at the Capitol when I spoke at the rally a few weeks ago, I was just sort of floored. I was going over some of Ron's positions, and I mentioned abolishing the Federal Reserve System, and the House came down. There were over 300 people there, and I turned around and looked at Representative Charles Key that was there, and I just said, this is unbelievable. You know, here's a huge line with massive applause for abolishing the Federal Reserve, and half the people there were clearly under 30. So there's something, there's a confluence of events. I talked at that time about Victor Hugo's quote that there's nothing as powerful as an idea whose time has come, and I think the idea for freedom is coming again, and my hope is that win or lose, obviously Ron Paul is a long shot because the media will not give him any credibility. They don't list him in the top 10. Is Katie Couric's doing her top 10 candidates? Well, he was not one of those, and so forth. So they're doing everything they can to ignore him. But my message to the young people there is that they are the ones that need to dig in for a 20 and 30 year haul to really take this message and each one of them become little Ron Pauls, to educate themselves, to understand the philosophy of liberty. There's a great deal of literature out there, and begin to train themselves and their friends and their children because they have the most to gain from it.
Steve?
Okay. One of the other day I was watching one of the cable stations, and they had one of the Republican presidential candidates on it. And Glenn Beck, I think it was, asked about national sovereignty, and specifically talked about the highway that they're wanting to build from Mexico up to Kansas City, come right through Oklahoma and Texas, and so forth. And this candidate said that that would never happen as long as he was president of the United States. And then he brought up the law of the sea treaty as an example of something, would never happen while he was president. And talk about national sovereignty. What is Ron Paul's position on the concept of the national sovereignty of the United States?
Well, I mean, he's constitutional. I mean, he would not. He's for getting out of the United Nations. He would. Yes. He would not be for binding us to any of these treaties that are taking away our national sovereignty. I cannot imagine. I mean, this is one of the reasons they don't like him. To get to a position of credibility or leadership or influence for a Republican or a Democrat today, you basically are vetted and you sell your soul to the special interest. And the special interests, as we all know, are controlled by the big financial institutions, the big multinational corporations, what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, and it's just gotten so much worse and more insidious since then. And they are part of this new world order, if you will, this internationalist thinking, and Ron Paul would be totally against that. I mean,
Okay. I know that when the GATT, they passed the treaty creating the World Trade Organization. It was passed, you remember, right after the '94 elections, and there was a lot of, I guess, lame duck members of Congress that voted in that. Pat Buchanan commented at the time that the stench of bribery would be on the Capitol for a long time after that. Now, for years, I could sit down and tell you, the benefits of the concept of free trade, okay, and the comparative advantage and all that kind of stuff. But in the last few years, it seems like free trade has almost become a code word for destroying the national sovereignty of the United States. So how does, from your understanding, how does Dr. Paul see some of these treaties like WTO, NAFTA, CAFTA, and that North American Union that would, be created? I know he's for free trade, and yet he's against these quote free trade.
Well,
treaties.
he's against those. I mean, you don't need a complex 800-page document to define the boundaries of free trade. You and I, if I want to sell something to you and you want to buy it, I don't need him to set the terms for doing that. You and I can come to an agreement. So those are not free market kinds of treaties. Those are all designed to make all of the nations of the world or that are involved in it under increasing subservience to these globalist institutions, if you will. So Ron, I'm sure, has voted consistently against the involvement in any of those things and any of those kinds of treaties, and he's been one of the few people there that has had the courage to stand up to that. I know you've heard the old saying, we used to talk about when people we would work hard for got elected to Congress or to the Senate, that we'd say when our guys get elected, they're not our guys anymore. They go off to Washington and they start being buddy-buddy and friends and go along to get along, and that's a very powerful feeling. I was in the state legislature, and I know that feeling too well. I saw it, and I saw how it corrupted people, and I'm just in total admiration of the way that Ron Paul has been able to maintain his independence and continue to get reelected. I mean, he does it by standing for something, and he also gives his constituents, though, very good service, too. If they've got a problem, his staff works on it. So he serves his people, but he also stands for what he stands for, and he's gotten reelected continually.
As a Republican several
times. As a Republican, right. But he's never hidden his belief structure.
That's true. Now, one thing that a lot of libertarians would differ with conservative Republicans would be on the issue of abortion. And I know that Dr. Paul has been supported by, I've got here, Barbara Hagan, a former chair of the New Hampshire Right to Life Committee, has endorsed Ron Paul for president. Why would pro-lifers endorse a libertarian philosophy type person like Ron Paul?
Well, there are many libertarians that are pro-life. There are libertarians that are pro-abortion. Ron Paul's pro-life. His position is that the federal government should not be involved in that issue at all. It's something that was left to the states, and the federal government, through Roe v. Wade, usurped the states' rights to do that. And these are battles that should be fought at the state level. So that's his view on it, and he personally is very strongly pro-life, but he rightly so, I think, pinpoints that it's not a federal issue, because by making it a federal issue, they created pro-abortion laws across the country. And we didn't have that before it became a federalized issue. And the way things are going, it does not appear we're going to get a pro-life majority at the federal level, and rightfully so. The whole issue of abortion should be at the state level.
We've got about 2 minutes left here. Gary, did you have another question you'd like to ask?
Yeah, just one quick thing. A lot of people are going to argue, they're going to look at the polling numbers, these polling numbers that we worship every presidential election, and they're going to look at Ron Paul's numbers and say, well, gosh, he's not up there with Giuliani and Thompson and Romney and everything else. What would you say to someone who loses that and think, gosh, I might like what Paul believes in, but gosh, I don't know if he can win? What would you say to someone like that in terms of urging them why they should vote for Ron Paul?
They should vote for Ron Paul. If they believe in the Constitution and the philosophy of freedom, they should vote for the person who best represents that, and let the chips fall where they may. I mean, voting for someone just because they're the most electable in terms of what the anointed elites say is exactly the wrong reason to vote. Ayn Rand once said the lesser of two evils is still evil. And if people will start voting for who they think is best, then I think we will do a lot better in this nation. But this whole shibboleth of electability is how we got in this mess in the first place.
Kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. We don't vote for the guy who can't win, therefore he can't. And yeah, exactly.
Well, this program is not endorsing any candidates for president, but one thing that I might tell you that the great Ronald Reagan, Pat Buchanan tells about his last day in office the morning when he was going to leave, he sat down behind the desk for the last time, and he looked up at one of his advisors and said, you know, my biggest mistake in office was sending those Marines to Lebanon.
Really?
I think Ron Paul would probably have agreed with that.
Yeah, they were possibly appointing George Bush as his vice president.
No, that's another one.
No argument.
Thank you for being with us this evening, and join us next time for another edition of Oklahoma Politics and You.